2009, a restricted psychological research file circulated among a small number of senior IDF intelligence officers contained a single finding that nobody in the room knew how to explain. Female operatives assigned to isolated psychological operations posts, working alone, or in all-female two-person teams, without integration into standard mixed-unit formations, demonstrated a resistance rate to coordinated reality distortion environments that was, statistically, not supposed to exist. The number was 94%, meaning, in controlled assessment conditions designed to systematically erode an operative's grip on verified reality through contradictory information streams, social pressure cascades, fabricated consensus environments, and sustained sensory ambiguity protocols, 94% of female operatives in isolated postings maintained what researchers classified as level 1 cognitive integrity. Their situational assessments remained accurate. Their threat discrimination remained intact. Their reported certainty about verifiable facts did not degrade. The same conditions, applied to male operatives in standard mixed-unit formations, produced level 1 cognitive integrity retention in 34% of cases. The gap between those two numbers, 94 and 34, is not a rounding error. It is not a sample size artifact. It sat in that classified file for 3 years before anyone with institutional authority asked the question it demanded. Why? To understand why the finding took 3 years to produce a question, it helps to understand what psychological operations units in the IDF were officially described as doing, and what they were actually doing. Officially, PSYOP-adjacent intelligence units within the IDF were classified under cognitive warfare support functions. Their stated mandate involved the assessment, monitoring, and where necessary the disruption of enemy information environments. Personnel assigned to these units were selected through a combination of cognitive aptitude testing, psychological stability screening, and field performance evaluation. The work on paper looked like analysis, desk work, assessment. What it actually involved was sustained exposure to environments specifically engineered to make reality illegible. Operatives working in these functions were routinely subjected, both as part of training and as an occupational reality of the work itself, to what military psychologists began formally calling coordinated reality distortion environments, or CRDEs, in internal literature from the early 2000s. A CRDE is not a single psychological attack. It is an ecosystem. Multiple contradictory information streams arrive simultaneously from sources that appear credible. Social consensus within the operative's immediate environment is manufactured to contradict what the operative has independently verified. Sensory data is systematically ambiguated. The operative's own memory of prior assessments is challenged by colleagues, by documentation, by physical evidence that has been altered. The goal of a CRDE, whether deployed against an enemy operative or used in training to build resistance in one's own, is to make the operative doubt the reliability of their own perception, not to frighten them, not to overwhelm them with volume, to make them genuinely uncertain whether what they know is true. Women had been formally excluded from these units. The 2000 Equality Amendment to the military service law had opened the theoretical door. It stated that the right of women to serve in any role in the IDF was equal to the right of men. But theoretical doors and operational assignments are different architectures. The cognitive warfare support functions remain, in practice, male-dominated environments through the mid-2000s. The few women who were assigned to adjacent roles were integrated into mixed-unit formations. Their performance data was folded into unit-level aggregates. Their individual results disappeared into the group number, which is precisely why the anomaly took so long to surface. You cannot find a variable you have designed your data collection to make invisible. Before the finding can be understood, the thing it measures has to be. Reality distortion, as a deliberate warfare tool is not a new technology. Its principles appear in military and intelligence doctrine stretching back decades, operationalized with increasing sophistication as the understanding of cognitive psychology deepened through the latter half of the 20th century. What changed in the early 2000s was not the concept. It was the delivery infrastructure. The proliferation of digital communication channels, the acceleration of information volume, and the increasing difficulty of verifying source credibility created conditions in which coordinated reality distortion operations could be executed at a scale and speed that earlier doctrine had not anticipated. For an operative working in an intelligence function, the practical effect is specific and cumulative. It begins with noise, not chaos noise. The distinction matters. Chaos is a volume problem. Noise is a signal-to-noise problem. The operative receives information that is not false exactly, but that is framed, sequenced, and contextualized in ways that make accurate interpretation increasingly difficult. Two verified facts can be placed in relation to each other in ways that produce a false conclusion. A genuine document can be time-stamped incorrectly. A reliable source can be made to appear compromised through the strategic placement of adjacent information. Over time, and the timeline is shorter than most people assume, the operative's confidence in their own assessments begins to degrade, not because they are weak, because the environment has been engineered to make confidence epistemically unjustifiable. The rational response to a sustained CRDE is uncertainty. An operative who remains fully certain in a well-constructed CRDE is not demonstrating resilience. They are demonstrating that the CRDE has not yet reached them. The problem is that uncertainty, once it establishes itself in an operative's cognitive processing, does not stay contained to the specific domain where the CRDE introduced it. It spreads. Operatives who have been successfully subjected to sustained reality distortion conditions begin to doubt assessments they made before the CRDE began. They retroactively reinterpret prior verified intelligence. They become susceptible to social consensus pressure. If the people around them express certainty about something the operative is uncertain about, the operative defaults to the group's position even when the operative's independent data is more reliable. This is the mechanism. This is what the IDF's cognitive warfare support units were training operatives to resist and testing each other to produce. And this is what 94% of isolated female operatives were not experiencing. The researcher who first isolated the variable was not looking for it. Dr. Hannah Silver, a military psychologist attached to a Tel Aviv-based cognitive performance research unit, was conducting a retrospective analysis of operative assessment accuracy across a range of intelligence functions when she noticed something that did not fit the model she was working with. The standard model predicted that operative cognitive performance under CRDE conditions would correlate primarily with three factors: prior cognitive aptitude scores, length of CRDE exposure, and quality of resistance training received. These three variables accounted for most of the variance in the data she was reviewing. Most, not all. There was a subset of operative performance records that the model consistently failed to predict. Operatives whose aptitude scores were average, whose CRDE exposure had been substantial, and whose resistance training had been standard, but whose assessment accuracy under distortion conditions remained anomalously high. She pulled the personnel files. They were, without exception, female operatives who had been assigned to isolated or near-isolated postings. Not female operatives in general. That distinction would prove critical and also, for a time, would prove to be the source of institutional confusion about what the finding meant. Female operatives integrated into standard mixed-unit formations did not show the anomaly. Their performance curves tracked closely with male colleagues in equivalent positions. The isolation variable was not about gender in isolation. It was about gender in a specific structural condition. when a female operative was removed from a mixed-unit social environment, when she was working alone or with one other female colleague, in a posting that did not integrate her into a larger group formation. Something in her cognitive processing of CRDE inputs changed. The most precise way to describe what changed is this: her reference point for consensus shifted. In a mixed-unit formation, the operative's assessment of what is real is continuously, unconsciously calibrated against the assessments of the people around her. This is not weakness. It is normal human cognition operating in a social environment. The group's apparent consensus functions as a real-time validity check. When a CRDE manufactures false consensus within the unit, when it makes colleagues appear to agree on a version of reality that is incorrect, the integrated operative's individual assessment is pulled toward that false consensus. The social pressure is not experienced as pressure. It is experienced as evidence. The isolated operative does not have this reference point available. There is no group consensus to defer to. The only available validity check is the operative's own prior verified data, which is, and this is the part that took military psychologists some time to accept, actually the more epistemically reliable check under CRDE conditions, because it is the one that the CRDE has not been able to contaminate through social engineering. The isolation that military institutions had understood as a vulnerability. A female operative alone, without unit support, without the social cohesion of a mixed formation, was, in a CRDE environment, a structural advantage. The thing designed to protect her was the thing that would have broken her. The pattern did not emerge from a single study. It accumulated, case by case, across more than a decade of operational records before the aggregate picture became impossible to dismiss. 2003. An intelligence assessment unit operating in a high CRDE exposure function produces a performance review that flags an anomaly in one operative's record. She has been working in a near-isolated posting for 11 months. Her assessment accuracy during a period of sustained coordinated information warfare is rated in the top 2% of all operatives reviewed that cycle. Her supervisor's note describes her performance as unusual given circumstances. The circumstances are not further examined. The file is marked and archived. 2005. A cognitive performance review conducted across 3 intelligence units identifies a cluster of high-performing outliers whose profiles do not match the standard predictive model. 6 of the 7 outliers are female. 5 of the 6 have been in isolated or semi-isolated postings for at least 8 months prior to the assessment period. The review recommends further study. The recommendation is not action. The review's authors are told the sample size is too small to draw conclusions. 2007. A male operative in a mixed-unit cognitive warfare function files a formal performance concern about a female colleague who has recently been integrated into his unit from an isolated posting. His concern: she is not updating her assessments when new information arrives. She is, in his characterization, inflexible. A supervisory review finds her assessments are more accurate than her colleagues. The integration continues. The tension is noted in unit records. 2008. Dr. Silver's research unit receives access to a longitudinal performance dataset spanning 7 years of cognitive warfare function assessments. The dataset includes, for the first time, a sufficiently large cohort of female operatives with isolated posting histories to permit meaningful statistical analysis. The 94% figure emerges from this dataset. The finding is written up as a preliminary internal report. Distribution is restricted to senior intelligence psychology staff. 2010. The preliminary report is formally reviewed by a joint committee of military psychologists and operational commanders. The committee's conclusion is that the finding is statistically significant but operationally ambiguous. The recommendation is for a controlled prospective study. Funding for the study is approved at a reduced level. The study timeline is set at 4 years. 2012. Interim results from the prospective study are consistent with the retrospective findings. The isolation variable holds across different CRDE protocols, different operational contexts, and different duration parameters. The finding is no longer preliminary. A second committee is convened to consider operational implications. 2014. The prospective study concludes. Its findings are consistent with everything that came before. The gap between isolated female operative performance and mixed-unit male operative performance under sustained CRDE conditions is confirmed at statistically significant levels across all tested protocols. The study is classified. Its operational recommendations sit in a distribution queue for 14 months before reaching the relevant unit commanders. 2016. The first formal operational adjustment is made. A cognitive warfare support unit begins selectively assigning female operatives to isolated assessment functions based on the research findings. The adjustment is not announced. It is not policy. It is one commander making one decision based on data he has read. The unit's performance metrics improve measurably within 18 months. 2019. A second unit makes the same adjustment independently, having reached the same data through different channels. The two units are not in communication about this decision. The parallel is noted by a researcher reviewing cross-unit performance data. It is described in an internal paper as convergent operational adaptation. The paper recommends formal policy consideration. 2021. Formal policy consideration is ongoing. The data was not the problem. From the moment Dr. Silver's preliminary report entered institutional circulation in 2008, the data itself was rarely challenged on methodological grounds. The sample sizes were adequate. The statistical methods were sound. The controls were appropriate. Researchers who reviewed the work found it difficult to identify technical fault with what it said. What the institution found difficult was what it meant. The first line of resistance was reclassification. The finding was described in various internal communications across the years following the initial report as a training artifact, a selection artifact, a measurement artifact. The argument in each case was structurally similar. The anomaly was not real. It was a product of how the data had been collected, or how the subjects had been selected, or how the assessments had been designed. These arguments did not survive contact with the prospective study's methodology, which had been specifically designed to address them. They were made anyway, with decreasing conviction and increasing frequency, across a period of roughly 4 years. The second line of resistance was scope limitation. The finding was real, this position acknowledged, but it was narrow. It applied only to specific CRDE protocols. It applied only to specific posting durations. It applied only under specific operational conditions that were unlikely to generalize. The practical implication of this position was that no operational adjustment was required because the finding described a special case rather than a pattern. The prospective study's cross-protocol consistency made this position increasingly difficult to maintain after 2014. It remained in circulation regardless. The third line of resistance was the one that appeared least frequently in formal documentation and most frequently in informal communication. The adjustment would require acknowledging that the institutional decision to exclude women from these functions had been, for a period of decades, a strategic error. Not an ethical error. The institution had a reasonably well-developed vocabulary for discussing ethical errors in gender integration policy, having navigated that vocabulary publicly since the 1995 Alice Miller case. A strategic error, the kind that costs operational effectiveness. The kind that, had the question been asked and the data collected 2 decades earlier, might have produced different outcomes in specific operations whose classified records nobody in the room wanted to think too carefully about. That acknowledgement did not appear in any formal document. The operational adjustments that began in 2016 were made without it. The data was used. The conclusion it implied was not stated. This is a common institutional maneuver, and it works, in the narrow sense that it produces operational improvement without requiring the institution to confront the cost of the delay. What it does not produce is policy. As of the most recent available data, the operational adjustments made in 2016 and 2019 remain unit-level decisions rather than IDF-wide protocol. The research findings that motivated them are classified. The female operatives whose performance data generated the finding continue to serve in postings that are determined by assignment processes that do not formally incorporate the isolation variable as a placement criterion. The data knows what it found. The institution has not yet decided what to do with knowing. The honest answer is that researchers do not fully agree. What they agree on is the phenomenology, the observable description of what happens. Female operatives in isolated postings under CRDE conditions maintain higher assessment accuracy. Their confidence calibration, the alignment between how certain they feel about an assessment and how accurate that assessment actually is, remains more stable under sustained distortion pressure. Their susceptibility to manufactured social consensus is measurably lower when the social environment that would carry that consensus is absent. Why this is true is where the agreement ends and the competing frameworks begin. The most structurally parsimonious explanation, and the one that Dr. Silver's research unit has most consistently endorsed, is the reference point hypothesis. Under normal cognitive operating conditions, social consensus functions as a legitimate validity check. If 12 people who have access to the same information you have access to all conclude the same thing, that consensus is weak evidence that their conclusion is correct. The rational mind incorporates this evidence. In a CRDE, this rational process is weaponized. The manufactured consensus is specifically designed to look indistinguishable from genuine consensus. The integrated operative cannot tell the difference between a real validity check and an engineered one, so the brain's standard process of social calibration becomes a vulnerability. The isolated operative, by structural circumstance, does not have access to social consensus at all. The reference point is absent. The brain defaults to what it has: prior verified data, independent assessment, internally generated confidence metrics. These are, under CRDE conditions, the more reliable inputs. The operative is not smarter or more resistant in some intrinsic sense. She is operating with a degraded social environment that happens to be less contaminated than the fully social one. The competing hypothesis, advanced by a smaller group of researchers working in behavioral cognitive science rather than military psychology, proposes a socialization-based mechanism. This framework argues that women in high-pressure institutional environments develop through sustained experience of being structurally isolated, of being the only woman in a room, of having their assessments discounted, of operating without the social validation that male colleagues receive as institutional default, a practiced reliance on internally generated confidence metrics that male operatives in equivalent cognitive functions do not develop to the same degree because they have not needed to. This framework is more uncomfortable institutionally because it suggests that the cognitive advantage the data describes is not despite the exclusion and marginalization that female operatives experienced in IDF institutional culture. It is in part because of it. That interpretation does not appear in formal research conclusions. It appears in the footnotes. A third, less developed framework proposes neurobiological mechanisms related to stress hormone profiles and their interaction with cognitive processing under sustained uncertainty. The evidence base for this framework is thinner, and the institutional appetite for this line of inquiry has been limited. It is mentioned here for completeness, and because intellectual honesty about an incompletely understood phenomenon requires acknowledging the edges of what is not yet known. What What all three frameworks agree on is the operational implication. The isolation variable is real, it is measurable, and it is not transferable through training alone. You cannot train a mixed-unit male operative to perform as if he were isolated. The structural condition is the condition. The advantage lives in the architecture, not in the individual. Phase 8 current state and the remaining gap. As of 2023, the IDF's formal integration of women into cognitive warfare support functions has advanced considerably from the near-total exclusion of the early 2000s. Women now serve across a broad range of intelligence and cognitive operations functions. The 2000 Equality Amendment's theoretical promise has moved closer to operational reality, at least in aggregate numbers. The research on isolated operative performance is known, within relevant specialist communities, to a wider audience than the 2008 classification level initially permitted. The operational adjustment rate tells a different story. Of the IDF units whose operational mandates place them in regular high CRD exposure environments, the units for which the isolation variable finding is most directly operationally relevant, formal integration of the research findings into assignment and posting protocols has occurred in a number that researchers familiar with the data describe, in informal communication, as disappointing. The number is not publicly available. What is available is the gap it implies. Between the date the prospective study concluded in 2014 and the present, a period of nearly a decade has elapsed during which the finding has been confirmed, circulated in classified form, independently replicated at unit level, and formally recommended for policy consideration. The policy consideration remains ongoing. Units continue to assign operatives to isolated high CRD exposure postings without formal reference to the performance data that identifies which operatives are most likely to maintain cognitive integrity in those conditions. The female operatives who would benefit most from the recognition that their structural positioning constitutes an operational advantage continue, in most units, to be assigned to isolated postings for administrative and logistical reasons, because there are not enough of them to fill mixed-unit slots, because housing and facility configurations make mixed integration complicated, because the institutional friction of full integration has not been fully resolved, rather than because anyone in the assignment chain has read the research and made a deliberate decision based on what it says. They perform well anyway. The data continues to accumulate. The policy queue continues to move at the speed of institutions that have not yet decided that what they know requires them to change what they do. Phase 9, three-factor synthesis and exit. Three forces shaped why it took this long to find what the data had been trying to say. The first was research design blind spot. For the finding to emerge, female operatives in isolated postings needed to constitute a large enough cohort to permit statistical analysis. That cohort did not exist at scale until the mid-2000s, because the institutional exclusion of women from these functions had ensured that the sample size required to see the pattern was unavailable for the period during which the pattern was already present. The data could not find itself until the institution had admitted enough subjects to be found. The second was the integration assumption. Military psychology research on CRDE resistance had been designed, from its earliest iterations, around the assumption that the relevant unit of analysis was the mixed unit formation. Individual operative variance was understood as noise within the unit level signal, a finding that lived in individual variance, and specifically in a structural condition that applied to a minority of operatives within those formations, was not the kind of finding the research infrastructure was built to surface. It had to be found retrospectively, by a researcher looking at a different question, noticing something that didn't fit her model. The third was the cost of the conclusion. Institutions are not well designed to discover, process, and act on findings that imply that a prior institutional decision was a strategic error. The ethical dimension of gender exclusion had been publicly litigated, and the IDF had adjusted its formal policies accordingly. The strategic dimension, the operational cost, ineffectiveness, and accuracy of having excluded from its most cognitively demanding functions the operatives who were, in the specific condition those functions produced, its most cognitively capable, had no equivalent public process. It had classified reports, restricted distribution, committee reviews, and a policy queue that moved at the speed of institutional reluctance. The 94% figure is still in that file from 2009. The question it demanded has been asked, answered, confirmed, replicated, and recommended for action. The gap between what the data says and what the institution has done with it is not 94%. It is not 34%. It is the distance between a number that exists and a policy that doesn't. That distance does not have a name yet. It is being measured.